So our second keynote speaker this morning is Raghu Das. Raghu is the CEO of IDTechEx. He has a natural science degree from Cambridge University in the UK, where he studied physics. He's tracked emerging technologies for over 17 years and has helped organizations large and small, from Fortune 50 companies to startups. His analysis of the industries that we live in and his market forecasts have been cited globally in publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. Today, Raghu is going to talk to about RAIN and the NFC market status and outlook and innovations. Please welcome Raghu Das.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Steve. It's a real honor for me to have been invited here. Just following up from Anthony's talk earlier, I remember a few years ago interviewing a system integrator in RFID, and they told me that when they sold themselves and pitched themselves as an RFID company, they had a lot of failure trying to get business. But when they pitched themselves as a company providing solutions to fix particular problems, they had a huge amount of success. And so one thing I'm going to do in this presentation is to cover the range of ways that RFID is helping companies, businesses and consumers do things better, save money, and provide extra value. So I'll be giving a few case studies, and then I'm going to go into the different details about NFC and RAIN RFID to give you an overview as to where the market size is, where the growth sectors over the short term, and the history as well. So just to give you a quick overview of IDTechEx, for those of you who are new to us, we are 80 people, we're based over 4 countries, and we have a range of people who focus on each of these technology areas. And our aim is to help provide clarity in these areas by scoping the whole value chain, what the different players are doing, and ultimately ending up with what are the overall trends, market sizing, and so on. So we really hope it saves our clients a lot of time and money trying to understand the marketplace they're looking to get into it, and also find their opportunities within it. So within this presentation, like all our work, I'll be giving you a very unbiased overview as to where we currently think the RFID sector is. So I know some of you are new to RFID, and I've been asked to start off just to give you the big picture and introduce the whole landscape to you. So RFID, as Steve has explained, is a wireless technology connecting things. And very simply, it works by having a reader or an interrogator which can detect data from a tag, which can be in the form of a label, an inlay, or a fob. If we go to things like NFC, that definition doesn't always quite work because it can also be 2 readers, say 2 cell phones coming together and also communicating as well. But the key thing is that it's very much an enabling technology. So as you can see from the bottom here, there's not just one type of RFID. There are versions which are passive. They have no power source. These are very low cost relatively to other technologies because they're usually just a silicon chip with an antenna. And then we have versions which have more sophistication. So they have more, for example, they have sensors, they have a power source. This adds to the cost, but they can do a few other things. So if we look at some of the detail behind each of these, even within passive RFID, there are different frequencies at which these can operate, and these different frequencies are suited to different applications. So some, such as low frequency RFID, is being used for things like your pets, tagging those, where it works very well at those ranges involved. But the main focus of this presentation that we're looking at is HF RFID, which is really encompassed by NFC, and also UHF, which is encompassed by RAIN. And both have different benefits to some degree, and they're tackling different applications. And there's a slide overlap potentially, but in the main, they're doing very different things. I'll be going through what those things are. It's worth noting just the sheer volume of devices that have been sold. So just last year alone, over 16 billion RFID tags, including NFC, RAIN, and LF all combined, were sold. So a huge number, one of the highest volume types of electronics made. So in total, the RFID market in 2017 is $11.1 billion. That includes the readers, the tags, the software, and also the integration and the services. But it's very pervasive and very much all around us today. Several of you will have contactless cards on you. That's RFID. Your car key fob will also have RFID enabled into it, and it's also appearing in things like toll roads, where it's been used for many years, tagging animals, apparel, and so on. And some of the key benefits of RFID is that it's not just about improving processes in the supply chain, making things more efficient, but also it's about increasing sales. So many retailers use RFID to reduce stockouts, and therefore they see sales increase without changing their stock level, just by better replenishment of the item on the shelf, reporting in some cases sales increases of up to about 20%. In other applications, RFID make things more convenient. So it's not even done necessarily on an ROI payback calculation. We have, for example, ski resorts. We have transit systems around the world where instead of using a magnetic stripe ticket or barcode system, they're moving to RFID because it's much faster to get throughput through, and therefore they can handle more people as we have urban areas with higher and higher populations. So this is the full list of where tags are going. Every year we look at how many are sold and we track those against the different applications involved. And to the beginning of 2018, over 76 billion RFID tags we think have been sold. That's over the last 20 years or so. And as you can see, they're going into a very diverse range of applications. So the highest volume application has been retail apparel, and that's mostly rain. The second highest application is smart cards. These are used for transit. These are contactless cards, and also now, of course, contactless payments as well. And so that's also used at high volume, and that's at NFC. And as you can go through the list here, you see applications for tagging airline baggages to smart tickets being done at different frequencies. So the point is that RFID is there's a platform of technologies, and there's room for all these different frequencies and technologies behind them, and it's going into very diverse different applications with different needs. So the value chain is very much structured that we have a fairly horizontal play for IC supply and some inlay supply, but then comes in specialists who understand what the needs are in, for example, clothing versus books versus smart tickets, and they specialize in those different sectors as integrators. Just last year, in 2017, about 16.7 billion RFID tags were sold, with a total number of 76. You can see the numbers now are really growing quite considerably. In terms of how we see RFID fitting into the whole IoT ecosystem, so, there's a lot of, there's a soup of technologies. There's, low power, wide area networks, and there's also everything down to RFID. But if we look at the powered type nodes, we think that about 2 billion of those will be sold in 2020, going into a range of different devices. But the high volume, which will enable a lot of IoT, is really coming from RFID, because it's at the bottom of the pyramid. It's the lowest cost, and therefore be the most widely deployed type of wireless identification or connectable device. And whereas with a lot of IoT, key applications we see coming through are smart homes for consumer convenience, and there's a lot of government push as well, funding many smart city schemes. We're seeing RFID being used for a very broad range of applications. In some ways, it's very mature, more mature than a lot of the new IoT sensor nodes coming through. So let's take a look at some of the areas where RFID is adding significant value today in full deployment. So some of these are well covered, but I'll briefly go through for those of you who are new to it, because it's always worth looking at the value that it brings. With apparel, we have billions of RAIN RFID tags being used to tag apparel around the world. And the main value here initially is to reduce out of stocks by telling the retailer what's not available on the shelf, replenishing those, and therefore preventing a lost sale. So retailers are seeing the sales increase from that, but now they're tagging these items, they're also getting more benefits by tracking them throughout the supply chain and having that greater visibility. So we're seeing ongoing rollout of tagging. The total addressable market for clothing is estimated to be about 80 billion units a year. This year, retail apparel will be less than 10 billion. So there's a huge amount of organic growth to go just in that sector alone, let alone all the new applications coming through, which is going into retail beyond apparel, but also things like luxury goods, jewelry, furnishings, which are already happening in stores like Decathlon and others. So here's just a few examples of some of the retailers who have deployed RAIN RFID, and that list is growing almost daily. And some of these are very large. So 2 years ago, Target, for example, announced that they would be tagging the majority of apparel, and that was a jump of over 1 billion tags as that came in. And so as the time goes over the coming few years, we expect to see more retailers come out with commitments, and these will help increase the growth of RAIN RFID, and that's just for apparel alone, let alone some of the applications. So looking at some of the other applications outside of apparel that are very strong, we see a lot of use of radar RFID for tagging containers, tagging parts. Here, customers use anything from tens of thousands of tags per location to several million, and they all add up. There's a very long tail of applications in radar RFID, which adds up to what we think is several billion units. And here, organizations save significant amounts of time and have much better traceability and a view as to where things are. Late last year, Mercedes-Benz, in the automotive manufacturing supply chain, they will be using up to 40 tags per vehicle for their Sprinter van, just so they can save a lot of manual time. Instead of reading barcodes off these devices, they can completely automate those processes. So we're seeing RFID being used in a range of manufacturing, part tagging, logistics, and so on. Another strong growth area for this sector is healthcare. Here we are, RFID again being used to automate processes, save time, meet with compliance, so safety and regulatory standards, by having a very accurate and automated, history and evidence of where that device has been. And there's many applications now where we see very strong payback. And there's many healthcare centers, hospitals, dentists that are using RFID. We have RFID-enabled cabinets, for example, where one site had these over all 30 plus of their locations. And at any one point in time, they would have complete visibility of what's in those fridges. And it meant that they could utilize them much better. They know when things were going off and use those first. And it also helps save a lot of time because they could automate all the documentation and the billing as well. So that's just one example of many. There's others on the slide here, and Rain RFID have white papers on this to tell you much more. Governments sometimes are seen as quite bureaucratic and slow-moving, but actually they've really pushed RFID. If we look at NFC and the origins of that in HF, a lot of that took off with governments, particularly in Asia, funding RFID for transportation systems. So rather than putting a ticket through and maintaining mechanical readers and the delay, people can walk through as you all use them now. And so that was initially pushed through and funded by the government. We've seen that spring up all around the world. And that's now transitioned to payments, which is very popular. For example, our largest retailer in the UK, where I'm from, Tesco's, told me a few years ago that half of all the revenue they make, they collect in cash. So that's $60 billion in cash that they handle each year at that time. And just the volume and handling that is a huge headache for them. But over the last few years, they've seen significant uptake, as have many other retailers around the world, in contactless payments, which is making that problem a lot easier for them. In other areas, governments are mandating RFID, such as anti-counterfeiting in South Korea. So here, the South Korean government had an issue whereby they felt they weren't collecting all the taxes due to them on whiskey products sold, and that's because some establishments were evading tax. And so now they've made it law that you have to tag all these premium whiskey bottles, and so they know what's out there and they can collect the right tax. Also seeing the use by governments of RFID in things like passports and many other applications. So governments are a strong driver of the technology, and they don't do it necessarily for an ROI in the way that some businesses may do it. Their payback is greater safety, more efficiency, having more people live in the same cities and get more people through the transportation system. And then there's a key element, which I think will be one of the bigger opportunities for RFID over the coming years, which is adding a lot more value to consumers, making our lives more convenient. Already we're seeing several examples of that. RFID is being used in things like theme parks, where people now can bypass the queues, they can do payments, and everyone's much happier because they don't have to waste time in queues. But also theme parks that are using this have found that people on average spend more. In some cases, I've read $20 more per person per visit, because it's easier for them to interact and engage. In other areas, we're getting huge amounts of data through from RFID, and even what might look like fairly simple things like the Coca-Cola freestyle machine. Thanks to its use of RFID, it also now provides a significant amount of data to Coca-Cola about what the consumption is of different flavors in the location they're based in. So now for the first time, Coca-Cola know what is the preference in various locations, Atlanta versus Boston, also how that changes over time of day. So they can really focus their marketing based on the demographic and based on the data they're getting back. So they're just a few ways that RFID is already making a large impact. And we're really, I think, the tip of the iceberg, because even though 16+ billion was sold last year, that's still a tiny proportion of all the opportunity it can get into. It's estimated to be over 5 trillion barcodes printed each year, just to give you some idea of what that total addressable market could be. But now I'm going to look into the overall sector of NFC for a few slides and the sizing of that sector. And to give some background to this, as I mentioned earlier, this was initially pushed, well over 25 years ago now and deployed for things like transit systems. So very much government push, and that's now moved into tickets and also payments. Looking at some of our data as to where these are being used, on the chart on the left here, you can see the sales of NFC and HF RFID in terms of millions of units, the highlight being contactless cards. There's also, of course, a large opportunity for NFC outside of this form factor. So here we're just looking at labels and fobs and cards. NFC is also being integrated into cell phones and other sectors, which isn't covered in this aspect. This is just the end fob device. And the main highlight is that 3.7 billion of these devices are in the form of contactless cards, because payment is still driving it. People have several payment cards that are contactless, and that is getting more and more ingrained in countries around the world. The second biggest sector is smart ticketing. So where people have already installed RFID readers for transit systems, for the one-day use, they still quite often use a magnetic stripe ticket. And even though that's cheaper than an RFID ticket, you've got to maintain the mechanical readers, and overall the system cost is higher. So several cities are now moving completely to solid state RFID, no magnetic ticket, even for single day use. Places like Moscow, Seoul in Korea, where you use an RFID ticket for a day using the solid state infrastructure that's installed, so they don't have to maintain this expensive mechanical equipment. But if we look at the value of applications on the right, passports feature very highly because the price per tag, per passport is much higher because of all the security and biometric information that goes into it. And there's now over 70 countries tagging passports. Looking beyond that, the category other NFC applications covers a whole range of diverse sectors, which we'll look at now. And this is really one of the growth areas of NFC. It's the tattoo you have and you were given. We're also seeing it being used for things like Bluetooth pairing, computer games, Remind Me stickers, and much more. But many are focusing on the smart packaging sector. The reason for that is that brands have big problems that they're trying to solve, and NFC might be a way to do that. You can see that on the picture on the right here. So Pims is a brand from Diageo, and it's a brand that's many decades old, and Diageo spent a lot of money marketing that brand. What you see on the left is the supermarket equivalents, where they change enough of the logo and the design and the name that they avoid any legal issues, but still they're leveraging off all the investment made by Diageo. And so brands are looking, one, to use RFID in the supply chain as they increasingly are, but very importantly to them is how can they use this technology to increase sales and create customer loyalty and provide differentiation that's valued. And this is where we're seeing a lot of activity with NFC. At the moment, a lot of that is still in pilots and trials. We're not seeing units of tens of millions per brand coming through, but almost every day we hear more case studies. So it's an area which we think is growing, but companies have to find the right balance for the current price of these tags versus how they're going to adopt it in such a large open system. But this is a key area where companies are looking at for NFC as we go forward. Moving on to RAIN RFID. Here in the bar chart, I show the sales of RAIN inlays over the last few years. And as you can see, there's been substantial growth. The biggest application in blue there has been retail apparel tagging. You also see that over the last few years, there's been a growth in the light blue, which is other retail items. That's things like jewelry, soft furnishings, and so on. And a large number are going into asset tracking, part tracking, logistic tracking, which even though, as I mentioned, per site, may be a fairly small number of units, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, a few million, they're getting such a strong payback and success with it that's being rolled out in a cookie cutter style across many locations. So those numbers are all adding up into fairly significant figures. One of the reasons for the strong adoption of RAIN RFID is that over the last 10 years, there's been huge developments with technology. So we have, as Steve mentioned earlier, very robust, interoperable, global standards, and also countries have aligned on the types of frequencies they can use around it. And also the performance has significantly improved and continues to significantly improve. On average, tag sensitivity is improved by about 10% year on year. And that means that as they become more sensitive, they have higher and higher read rates in harder environments traditionally, where you may have, say, lots of metal and fluid, but they're overcoming those, and which means that they can open up to more and more opportunities. On the right-hand side, the other difference is the strong confidence now in the industry. So not just in the value chain, which is very established with large players coming through, but also still lots of innovation, and we're seeing prices being very stable and reduce as volumes go up. But also, I think most importantly, a lot of industrial players over the last 10 years have used, piloted, experimented with RAIN RFID, and now have a really good understanding of the value it provides. And going back to Anthony's presentation, it's less talk about RFID, and it's much more talk about, the value that can be provided from this enabling technology. And as a result, we're seeing many organizations beginning to roll this out quite quickly. Delta recently announced that they'll be tagging baggage. We're seeing it in the automotive space from Mercedes and other car makers and so on. So end users, I think, have a very good understanding of RFID, and that's supporting the growth of it. And so overall, this is our outlook over the coming years. This is the sales of RAIN RFID tags. So in the chart here, we're looking at the market value for inlays and tags. We see this growth over the years. There will be times where you get, step changes in size because you have large retailers coming in committing to big numbers. But overall, the line is very strong and heading in the right direction. In terms of IC sales in 2016, when we looked at that this time last year, we put out about 10.6 billion IC sales. For 2017, we haven't yet got all the data. We will have in a few weeks, but we think it will be between 12.2 to 12.6 billion ICs sold. So that gives you an idea as to the sort of level of growth we're seeing. And it is worth pointing that IC sales are slightly different to inlay sales because there is some time lag for converting those as well. And so in the table, on the chart here on the left, we're looking at inlay sales versus IC. We expect IC sales to grow by 15 to 20% this year, with ongoing deployments in apparel, but also the growth in this long tail of applications which are beginning to get volume. Moving on to the RFID reader market. So here we break down the sales of RFID readers by frequency in terms of numbers and value. As you can see, the ubiquitous RFID reader system is NFC, being in so many cell phones and other devices. And so it's why a lot of organizations are looking to leverage off that. So many of the big brands that we've interviewed over the years have held back somewhat from looking at NFC on packaging until Apple have opened it up, which they now have. And so we're seeing more and more interest in case studies coming through in that regard. So NFC is very much a consumer tool for things like payments, whereas most of RAIN is still B2B, and and we've covered the growth there. But there's also potentially, the convergence of RAIN readers in cell phones over the coming years. You can already buy RAIN-enabled cell phones, but it's not targeted at the consumer space, more at the business space. We're also seeing a strong rise in combining these frequencies as well. There's companies like EM Microelectronic here who have dual frequency ICs, and these are being deployed in a range of different applications where you use RAIN for long range reading, but at the consumer level, they can use their cell phone and use the NFC device. So looking at the value chain, we think there's about 800 to 1,000 companies involved in RFID, and I must stress on this chart, these are our estimates, and this is by no means going to be complete, so I've only shown a few here, just because I want to make a few points as to some of the reasons why some of the companies are larger than perhaps some of the ones which are still in that green bracket at the bottom. So if you look at those with $100 million plus sales in RFID revenue, typically the characteristic is that they tend to be, focused integrators. So they don't try and do many verticals, but they focus on one or two sectors. The largest RFID company we believe by sales is HID, owned by Assa Abloy, about $1 billion in RFID only sales. And this organization are very focused on secure access and personal ID for things like passports, and others like Orthex and animal tagging and so on. We then have the horizontal IC suppliers who feature in that, who sell, of course, IC to the whole horizontal platform of organizations that make inlays. And for that middle tier, the organizations who make the inlays and the tags, many of these we find specialized. They find markets where they have vertical knowledge and so build tags to fix a very particular problem, or others do it by getting a lot of scale and tackling the biggest markets. Looking at some of the different trends by territory, while rain in NFC is used, fairly broadly now in all the main continents, NFC has been particularly strong in Asia foremost. Rain has lagged a little bit in terms of adoption. It's taken a bit longer to agree all the frequency standards they can use there, but that's now all done, and we're seeing that beginning to be rolled out in apparel. Whereas Europe and the US have led a little bit more in rain adoption, and now we're seeing also very strong adoption in NFC, of course, with ubiquitous contactless payments. Tag supply is mainly being done in Asia, where about 70% of production for inlays is there, but a lot of the IC makers and a lot of the companies doing the production in China are based in Europe and the US as well. And in terms of integration, we find this gets very vertically specialized with organizations, as I mentioned, focusing on particular sectors. So I just wanted to finish off by looking at some of the new things coming through. People are looking to leverage the extensive RFID infrastructure and the capabilities that are now available, where so much investment's gone into them to make them as reliable and as low cost as they are. And one area that's being disrupted is around the data logger market. So conventionally, this is a market with boxes of electronics as tags that you put into shipments to monitor things like temperature and humidity, and it's not really changed much over many years. Companies actually get most of the money from the analytics they provide, and they calibrate the sensors and so on. But now, thanks to RFID ICs coming in, which can be NFC, rain, or both, with sensing capability or interfaces to sensors, we are beginning to see lower cost versions. But it's not just the tag cost, it's also the system cost, because you can use your existing NFC-enabled cell phone to read the data off them. So now no more proprietary wireless systems or laptops with USB connections need to be acquired to pull the data off. So that's one area we see growing, and there's organizations at this event who will be talking more about that today. And also on sensors are passive RFID sensor labels. So unlike the last slide, which had a power source, these have no power source. So they're limited in terms of read range by the read range of the reader. But these are being used in their millions in a range of applications. They include things like predictive maintenance, so monitoring temperatures in some hotspots for generators. If these get too hot, they undergo an irreversible change in magnetism, and then it's quite an expensive thing to resolve. And so with these systems, they can monitor the temperature and they can fix it before it's an issue, or they can also call out the engineer to come and replace it when it's reached the end of its life. So this is now done rather than a use by date label, which doesn't actually monitor performance over time. And as a result, we're seeing this being used in that application alone, and it's also being used in the automotive manufacturing sector. Then we're seeing RFID being used for transceiver, the benefits it brings from the wide range of reader infrastructure and interoperability, but adding more than, or doing more than just ID, but adding large area sensors. So here we have some work from Xerox PARC, who are quite local, another one from PST Sensors, and there's many others. And these are using the RFID element as a transceiver, but they're connecting to it large area sensor networks. So at the top, you see an image of a strain sensor. These can be inexpensive as opposed to conventional strain sensors, which were battery powered, and these can be fairly large area, fitted for life to the bridge or the building that you're monitoring. We also have organizations who are looking and even ultimately replacing a conventional silicon IC with a flexible version, and those companies will be presenting or here in this room, and they're looking to add value by going, for example, very thin, so they can be used in gaming cards, something that Cartamundi, for example, are currently looking at. So there's still an enormous amount of innovation coming through as the existing and incumbent markets in RFID are growing. So to finish off, this is our overall outlook for the RFID sector. This includes, again, all types of RFID, passive and active, broken out there by the different sectors you can see. It's a sector where overall it's growing from about 11.7 billion this year to just over $14 billion in 2022. Within that, you have a range of mature applications which aren't growing much, and some are even in decline by value because the price of, for example, contactless cards is falling. But you have then the real growth applications, which is mainly around RAIN and also in NFC labeling, which are driving that growth. So despite this success story, RFID has a huge, as I mentioned, total addressable market still, where it's only penetrating a fraction of the opportunity in apparel, barely penetrated, all the retail items and much more. So there's a huge volume to come over the coming years. And we're seeing more and more businesses really having to adopt RFID to remain competitive and staying one step ahead of their competitors. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Raghu. I think we have time for 2 quick questions before we take a break. So anybody got any questions for Raghu?